I think one of the key points to the book, it almost kind of feels like the main point of the book. There are various available versions of the Bible today, and these versions come from a series of translations. You've got Greek, you've got Hebrew, you've got Aramaic, you've got Latin. And there's been this long-standing suspicion among believers and non-believers alike that so much of the gospel is literally and figuratively lost in translation. And how do you address this in the book? One of the examples I kept turning over to Faith and going, did you know that? And my big did you know that was, ignorant as I am, is I didn't know, for example, that Hebrew, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't have any vowels. Am I correct? And there are some very specific examples where you take one phrase and it's like, let's play fill in the vowels. And it can change the meaning from one to another. So can you talk a little bit about the use of translation and how it impacts?
Sure. One of the questions that my students frequently ask is, what's the best translation? So that's another chapter. And so in that, I note that the Bible comes to us in languages that are quite foreign for most people. Biblical Hebrew, which yes, originally didn't have, or its earliest forms of these biblical texts didn't have any vowels, but we are grateful to these very well-learned rabbis of some centuries ago who've put some vowels in to help readers, but those are themselves secondary additions, so sometimes we may ask how accurate those vowel choices were. And I'm getting maybe too into the nitty-gritty. Yeah, translation is a really interesting issue because, of course, many people are using this text, appealing to it for some direction in their lives, but may not appreciate that what they are reading in English is actually a choice translators have had to make about how to render the original Hebrew or Greek. And sometimes that Hebrew or Greek lends itself to translations other than the single one a person may be reading. So I always recommend that folks have a number of, if you don't read Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic, a little bit of the Bible is written in Aramaic, then get a bunch of different translations, lay them out in front of you, and have a look at how they may vary. In places where they do usually indicate some fluidity in the original document. That said, we don't have an original Bible in the first place, which is another challenge for biblical studies.
The first 6 chapters of the book almost feels like prologue to what I call the juiciest parts of the book, which is where we talk a lot about the myriad hot-button issues that we face today. I think the chapter is entitled, We've Got Issues.
Yeah.
And we do. There's homosexuality and abortion, there's poverty, there's environmentalism, there's evolution versus creationism. And I'd like to read from one especially footnoted passage that discusses the Bible's complicated relationship with homosexuality. According to some biblical texts, a man could marry several, and these are all footnoted. According to some biblical texts, a man could marry several women. Marriage outside the faith was not okay, or at least problematic. A man had to marry his brother's widow. A female slave could be forced to serve as surrogate mothers, and female slaves could be forced to serve as surrogate mothers. Marriage in the Bible is rarely described as a result of mutual love. Paul adds that it's best not to marry at all. Does the Bible include texts that condemn homosexual behavior? Yes. Does this mean the Bible is anti-gay? Not necessarily. So wouldn't the critics of your book say that when you start parsing these writings, you start kind of teasing through them, whether in terms of translation or whatever, that it's just this kind of rationalization for moral relativism, that this is the excuse liberals and progressives, and yes, gay people would use to try and have it their way, and still being able to say, hey, we can be Christian and still blaspheme. And so how do you respond to that type of criticism, that when you're sort of creating that avenue for people to kind of excuse what some people find to be an immoral behavior?
Yeah. People use the Bible in lots of different ways, and people appeal to it in different ways. The most basic differences, I think, with respect to controversial issues is this, that some people will look for specific texts and sort of apply them literally. And other people, very specific ones, right? And other people will read kind of a collection of texts and draw conclusions from that. So a person may read one of these texts that seems to be condemnatory of homosexuality and say that God hates gays. And then someone else will read a sort of collection of texts and say, no, God is about inclusion and acceptance, and they may notice that there's nothing in the Bible having to do with a loving relationship between gay people. There's nothing in the Bible about that. So, so some people may derive their conclusion based on general principles, principles of love, acceptance, tolerance, though I'm kind of uncomfortable with that word. And others will look at specific texts and say, but the Bible says this, and quote a particular text. And that leads, I think, to irreconcilable differences. What I aim with this book to do, with Bible Babel to do, is to simply show how people do that. What are the texts that people appeal to when they argue on one side, for instance, that the Bible is anti-gay? And what are the texts or the ways in which people appeal to the Bible to say, no, it's not? So that's what I aim to do in that chapter, not so much to lay out my position politically or religiously even, but simply to show how people use this text in these ways, and then leave it up to the reader to kind of go with that as you do. I hope that's a fair treatment of the text.
Well, and we were talking about this before the interview. It's interesting that we seem these days to admit rather easily that we live in polarizing times. Generally, that gives way to the next sentence, which is one side is accusing the other of being the polarizer. Is it more difficult today, more than ever, to talk about this most complicated work with its most complicated history, where we just want to know, you know, what's the deal? Like, is this thumbs up or down? Like, is it evil or bad? Is it right or wrong? Just give me the, you know, give me the punchline.
Yeah.
And it just seems like now, when you say it's complicated, it just leads everybody to roll their eyes and go, well, I'm out of here. I needed the answer.
Yeah, yeah. I hope people stick around for a little while, at least to learn how each of these sides has something going for it. That is, they're not all Looney Tunes on either side, you know, say liberal or conservative, but instead are basing their position on real stuff. Now, how you value that is maybe another question. But I think it behooves us to listen to the other side anyway. At least then we can have some kind of dialogue. But yeah, I agree, we are in this kind of polarizing, or a culture that thrives on polarizing issues and taking one side and another, looking for the simple. But the Bible is, I like to describe it as a kind of, well, for one thing, it's an anthology, right? Even the word Bible means little library. So it's a collection of books. And so it is itself, and I love this about the Bible, a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. It's in conversation with itself. So you can easily, when you know that, you can appreciate how someone would say, the Bible says this, and then another person say, but the Bible says that. And yes, it does, and they are different things. And those are in conversation with one another. And one of the effects of that, I may be going too far afield here, but that I really appreciate about the Bible is that it then invites us to participate in the meaning making. That it has these different voices, and then we can be a part of that. Our reading is not without we bring our own stuff, right, to the table when we read this. And so, and I think the Bible invites that. But the more we know about the Bible, for instance, its historical context, the Bible is very patriarchal. Many of you have noticed that, I'm sure, and that's a very different cultural context, I have to say, thank goodness, than the one we live in here and now. I'm grateful for the opportunities that I enjoy as a woman in our culture. It's a very different cultural context than that out of which the Bible comes. Does that mean we toss the whole Bible out as, say, feminists? I feel no. I mean, there's so much richness in it. But we may not then, maybe we choose not to apply some of those texts so immediately into a very alien culture to the Bible. Ours is very different than that, to simply apply wholeheartedly texts that have a very different kind of cultural basis and come out of different contexts and were meaning in different ways and different times to ours seems to me to do it a disservice, injustice.